Turmoil and Reform.
Brown v. Board of Education was a court case related to the First Amendment. Bridget Mergens was denied the right to start a religious group at school by her principal. The court ordered the school to permit the club because it was an extracurricular activity. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is when the United States outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The 24th Amendment prohibits any poll tax in elections for federal officials. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 prohibits racial discrimination in voting. Plessy versus Ferguson was Herman Plessy argued that his right to equal protection of laws was violated because seats were segregated on public railroads. The court disagreed, but the case was later overturned by Brown versus Board of Education.
In 1961, the U.S. attempted to overthrow the communist leader of Cuba, Fidel Castro. It was a failure and an embarrassment to the U.S. This was known as the Bay of Pigs. The next year, the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred when Soviet missiles were ready to launch from Cuba. JFK decided to create a naval blockade on Cuba, and it was successful.
Détente was a diplomacy adopted by Nixon to close tensions between the United States, Russia, and the People's Republic of China. The Helsinki Accords was an agreement made in 1975 by U.S., Canada, and European nations, including the Soviet Union, that agreed to support human rights, and SALT I froze the number of strategic ballistic missiles launched.
The Vietnam War, which was not a very well supported, was a war that we joined on the South Vietnam side to help prevent the spread of communism. The supporters of Ho Chi Minh in the north were called Viet Minh. Those who were in the support of communism in the south were called Viet Cong. Near the end of the Cold War, Nixon called for Vietnamization, which was a process that would slowly remove American soldiers from the war and leave it to the South Vietnamese soldiers. This would lead to the fall of Saigon.
Due to the generation gap, the 1960s was very different from the 1950s. People moved away from conformity and family values towards anti-war, free expression, and mind expansion. The British invasion brought new yet controversial music. In 1969, Woodstock was the epitome of the counterculture. It was a 3-day-long festival of music and peace.
The Great Society was LBJ's goals on the areas of healthcare, education, the environment, discrimination, and poverty. LBJ took over after JFK was assassinated. HUD is the Department of Housing and Urban Development thought of by JFK. VISA was Kennedy's idea, founded as a Volunteers Service Act.
After the Vietnam War back at home, women who had been a huge support working in factories and taking many of what were traditional roles of men started seeing that they deserved more rights. So they started uniting and protesting. Betty Freeman, who wrote The Feminine Mystique, opened the eyes of many women, where she explained the idea of feminism and that everyone is created equal and that women deserve more freedoms.
Betty Friedan helped form the National Organization of Women. The main goal of this was to take action to bring women into the full participation in the mainstream of American society.
Medicare was created in 1965 to provide basic hospital care to most Americans over the age of 65, and Medicaid was created in 1965 to provide low-cost health insurance to poor Americans.
Nixon was really desperate to win the election in 1974, and to assure this would happen, he snuck into the department of his opponent. He was soon discovered and was taken to court, where he would keep denying he was at fault for anything and that he was not a crook. Tape recordings were entered from the White House that had an 18-minute gap, obvious that they had been messed with. Before the court had found him guilty, Nixon resigned on public television, assigning Gerald Ford, who then pardoned him for his mistakes.